Hello and welcome. My name is Irene Chalak, and I am the editor of American School and Hospital Facility Magazine and its website, facilitymanagement.com. I will be serving as the moderator during this event. Today's webinar is titled Recycling Fluorescent Lamps: Why, How, and What Happens If You Don't, and is brought to you by AirCycle Corporation, home of the award-winning Bulb Eater Lamp Crusher and Easy Pack recycling containers. Today's webinar will run approximately 45 minutes. A question and answer session will immediately follow, and you can submit your questions by typing them in on the GoToWebinar Control Panel Question tab and then click Send. The purpose of this webinar is to educate and discuss why it is important to recycle fluorescent lamps. Fluorescent lamps are everywhere. They're in the garage at home, at the grocery store, probably in your school, hospital, or office facility too. While fluorescent lamps save money and the environment by minimizing the use of electricity, often generated from coal-burning plants that release mercury into the air, each lamp itself contains a small amount of mercury and must be recycled to prevent the mercury from being released. Here to guide you through the sometimes complicated world of lamp recycling is Tom Griffin. Tom Griffin is the director and co-founder of Greener Results, the consulting division of AirCycle Corporation in Lisle, Illinois. In his 18-year career in Virginia state government, Tom developed and ran a wide array of voluntary pollution prevention-based programs that focused on cost savings and public recognition. Tom works for more than 12 years for Virginia DEQ's Office of Pollution Prevention, assisting businesses directly through assessments, research and development, and promotion of state and federal voluntary programs. Through this experience, Tom has distinguished himself as an expert in helping businesses develop efficient and practical environmental programs that are focused on improved performance and cost savings. And now, I am pleased to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Tom Griffin.
Thank you for having me, Irene, and thank you to everyone who is with us today. And of course, thanks to our sponsors. So today, it is all about fluorescent lamps and why it is important to recycle them. In addition, we'll look closely at the various options for how facility operators can recycle fluorescent lamps. And finally, we'll be discussing what could happen if you do not recycle your spent lamps. First, a couple of quick slides on my company background. Greener Results is a full-service sustainability consulting firm. Our focus areas are listed here, ranging from sustainability program design to lead advisory services, to the management of green certification and recognition programs. In all of our work, our main goal is to help our clients achieve improved environmental performance and improved profitability. Next, here is my ugly mug and a quick summary of my background. Yes, I worked for the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality for more than 16 years, where I provided technical assistance to hundreds of Virginia businesses. I also served as the state's waste minimization coordinator and developed outreach programs focused on reducing toxics, such as mercury. I've worked on EPA programs, and I've headed up many state-based programs that were focused on mercury reduction, including programs that encourage the recycling of fluorescent lamps. I was also directly involved in the coordination and setup for EPA's study on the practice of fluorescent lamp crushing. And now, as a consultant, I work to promote regulatory changes that encourage lamp recycling. All right, here we go. Let's talk lamps and why it is important to recycle them. If I had to answer this question in one simple statement, here would be my answer. Lamps contain mercury, a toxic material. Recycling reclaims that mercury, protects the environment and consequently protects human health. And recycling your lamps also protects the interest of your organization, because there are regulatory and legal implications if you do not recycle. All right, so I guess that was kind of a run-on sentence of an answer, but there is a lot to this whole issue. So next we are going to look more closely at all the details related to why you should recycle your lamps. First, let's look closely at what's in a lamp. Here's a nice diagram that shows the makeup of a typical fluorescent lamp. There's the glass tube with two metal end caps. They contain the electrodes that provide current by way of the lamp's ballast. The lamp glass is coated with phosphor, and the lamp is filled with an inert gas, in this case argon. And lastly, you have your drop of mercury, which when volatilized in the gas conducts electricity, and with the effect of phosphor creates light. So that's the basics on the construct of a lamp. Now here we show a breakdown of each material that is in the lamp itself. Of course, weights vary greatly according to the size of the lamp, but a typical 4-foot T8 lamp weighs approximately 3 to 4 pounds. And of the total, glass is by far the heaviest component. Then you have the metals associated with the end caps and electrodes. And next is the phosphorus or phosphor coating, which can be up to 2% by weight. And lastly, you have mercury, anywhere from 3 to 20 milligrams. But really, it makes up a very, very small percentage by weight. When we're talking about lamp recycling, we are talking about recycling all of these components back into useful products. And your recycler should be certifying that all of these are being recycled. But we are especially concerned with mercury. So here's mercury. Mercury is actually a pretty amazing material. Shown here, elemental mercury has often been referred to as quicksilver because it exists as a liquid. And because it is a liquid, it can be used in many forms of switches, gauges, and thermometers. And it has been used for many, many other applications. But mercury is considered to be a toxin, and it is near the top of EPA's toxics of concern because of its long-term effects on the environment, wildlife ecosystems, and on human health. Mercury is a very serious environmental problem. But one very important thing to remember is that the use of mercury, especially when used in fluorescent lamps, actually works to decrease the dispersion of mercury in the environment. And we will talk more about how that happens in just a few minutes. So let's first learn a little bit more about mercury. Historically, mercury has had so many beneficial uses. Certainly, mercury is important for lamps and for many, many industrial and electrical uses, switches, gauges, thermostats, manometers, barometers. It was also present in many batteries until just recently, and so many uses in healthcare, thermometers, blood pressure cuffs, and many kinds of equipment and machinery that used mercury switches and thermostats. Dental amalgams, and many lab chemicals, and even vaccines and medications that used mercury. So how does mercury get into the environment? Here are a couple of sources. The first picture is of a mercury mine. Mercury is found in ores, and the process of mining for mercury was a big source of contamination at one time. And I guess it does continue to be a problem in certain countries. And the leachate of abandoned mines and ore deposits is a problem too. But here on the right is the most significant source of mercury to the environment: power generation. and specifically coal burning power generation. Coal ore, to varying degrees, contains some amount of mercury, and its combustion results in the dispersion of mercury directly to the atmosphere. Next, we have three pictures that are all tied to one main source of mercury. The first picture shows an auto salvage yard. The one on the right shows the steel industry, which is typically known as the #2 source of mercury to the environment. But the slide in the middle is actually the culprit, the source of the mercury. These are the mercury-containing switches that were used in most cars made from the 1950s through the 1990s. And so when these cars are salvaged, the mercury in the switches eventually gets melted into steel. And so steel manufacturing is under great regulatory pressure to get the mercury out of salvaged vehicles. Medical and solid waste incinerators are also significant contributors of mercury emissions. These emissions result from the improper disposal of materials, such as thermometers, vaccines, medical equipment, and used lamps that are improperly disposed. Most healthcare systems have now moved away from incineration of their waste and are now autoclaving or steam sterilizing their medical waste. But this process does not eliminate mercury, and in fact basically just flushes it right into wastewater systems or vaporizes it on site. And so pictured here is a wastewater treatment plant. There are many plants that are under severe restrictions related to mercury, and the mercury has been traced to various sources, such as hospital autoclaves and dental offices. And mercury comes from various other sources too, certainly including lamps, and primarily the contamination comes from the improper disposal of these materials. In the case of lamps, when they are thrown into trash dumpsters, they end up going either to solid waste landfills or they are sent to municipal waste incinerators. In either case, the mercury can end up in the environment. All right, so that's the story of mercury and how we as a society have used it for everything. So now let's begin to address what the real dangers of mercury are. I do take mercury contamination very seriously, and certainly the EPA takes it seriously as well. But let's be sure to put this into context. There are probably a few of us mature types in the audience today, those of us who are old enough to have had the mercury experience in high school chemistry class, where the teacher poured a glob of mercury into our hands so that we might experience its liquid properties. Now this might sound like something that wasn't too smart, direct exposures to mercury in the classroom. And this practice has generally been stopped, as some spills did occur during this exercise. However, the point is that the act of holding that mercury in our hands did not hurt us. And so why is that? The reason is that elemental mercury itself is not acutely toxic. Mercury is a neurotoxin that only becomes toxic after it has been dispersed into the environment and is transformed into other compounds, primarily methyl mercury. This is not to say that elemental mercury is something that is completely safe to be around, as mercury fumes and vapors can cause breathing discomfort for many people. And significantly prolonged exposures to mercury vapors have been linked with some neurological effects. For instance, the Mad Hatter of Alice in Wonderland was based on actual 19th century hat makers who were significantly affected by prolonged exposure to mercury while making felt hats. EPA's website contains a description of the potential direct effects of mercury exposure, which includes trembling hands and numbness, tingling sensations in the lips, tongues, fingers and toes, fatigue, joint pain, and mental instability, speech and hearing difficulties, and various other impairments. The greatest risk of mercury are to fetuses and young children because their nervous systems are still developing. They are 4 to 5 times more sensitive to mercury than adults. Unborn children can be affected even though the mercury may not cause problems to their mothers. There are very few documented cases of these types of effects from direct exposures to elemental mercury. However, these debilitating effects are very real consequences from more indirect, chronic exposures to methylmercury as it bioaccumulates in the food chain. So here is the toxic form of mercury, methylmercury. Methylmercury is a neurotoxin and a form of mercury that is only created when mercury is exposed to the following conditions. First, mercury must be deposited in water, and this is why mercury discharges to wastewater are significant. However, the most significant impacts occur through air emissions, where mercury vapors are dispersed through incineration and eventually end up in water bodies. Second, anaerobic conditions must occur in order to transform mercury into methylmercury, and this occurs primarily in swamp-like conditions and in bottom sediments. And lastly, the real impacts of methylmercury are only realized when it bioaccumulates in the food chain. This is a graphic representation of how methylmercury is formed and how it bioaccumulates in the food chain. Methylation occurs in bottom sediments. Benthic organisms are exposed to methylmercury, and they in turn are eaten by larger organisms and finally by fish and birds, who are then potentially eaten by humans. Methylmercury syndrome is the name of the medical conditions that occur from exposures to methylmercury. And Minamata Bay in Japan is the recognized case study that demonstrates the acute effects of this toxin. Minamata Bay was a small fishing village, and local industrial operations dumped mercury into the bay. First documented in 1956, methylmercury syndrome resulted in the deaths of more than 2,100 people, and another 10,000 were affected by it. Minamata Bay made the world realize that mercury contamination affects us all to a certain degree, as some level of methylmercury is present in waters around the world, especially in the bioaccumulative fat tissues of fish. And here is the result. Do any of you out there like to fish? Or do any of you like to eat fish? I, for one, am both an avid fisherman and a great lover of eating fish. So these health warnings certainly do get my attention. More and more bodies of water are being posted each year, warning against or even banning the eating of fish. And certainly it should be alarming to us all that pregnant women, infants, and children are advised to not consume fish. All right, about now, some of you might be saying to yourselves, why do you use mercury-containing lamps? Well, here's the good news. Mercury emissions to the environment are actually reduced significantly by the use of fluorescent lamps. Do you remember our discussion about the sources of mercury to the environment? Power generation from coal-burning plants is the #1 contributor of mercury emissions to the environment. While fluorescent lamps are 4 to 10 times more efficient than traditional incandescent lighting. And the energy saved also avoids and protects the world from mercury emissions. This graphic shows that there are 4 milligrams of mercury in a compact fluorescent. Because the CFL is so efficient and long-lasting, it will avoid over 12.4 milligrams of mercury contamination through power generation. So fluorescent lamps are still doing a very good thing for the environment. However, we must prevent any and all mercury from being improperly disposed, as even small amounts of mercury do have serious implications for public health and the environment. And yet studies show that more than 500 million spent lamps a year are not recycled in this country and are therefore improperly disposed of. That equates to a lot of mercury, as indicated here, from 2 to 4 tons for mercury releases per year are due to broken lamps. And that amount eventually makes it back into the environment and into our food chain. So basically, by recycling lamps, you are keeping mercury out of the environment, protecting fish and wildlife, and in turn, you're protecting infants, children, and unborn fetuses from potential neurological disorders and other problems. And of course, recycling lamps will also facilitate regulatory compliance. And lamp recycling is an integral part of any effective environmental program. Conversely, well, this picture spells out big trouble. If you do not recycle your spent lamps, you are essentially contributing mercury to the environment and create direct exposures for your staff and the public. You are also creating the potential for regulatory compliance issues for your company, potential fines, and cleanup liabilities. And if your organization has any sort of environmental program in place to not recycle lamps, tells your staff, business partners, and potentially your customers that you either do not really care about the environment, or else you are simply not up on environmental regulations and issues enough to know that recycling lamps is required and very important. So recycling lamps is clearly the right choice. And in the rest of our presentation, we will be addressing the regulations that affect lamp recycling and the various ways that you can recycle lamps. But first, I believe that we are scheduled to have a quick break in our presentation to find out a little more about our audience and their current recycling practices. Irene, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Tom. We're going to put a question on the screen and give each of you about 15 seconds to answer the question. Okay, the question is, if you're currently not recycling lamps, why not? Please select one of the following. It's cheaper not to. I don't know how. The third choice, it's inconvenient. I use non-hazardous lamps. Or the last selection, I don't generate many lamps. Okay, please take some time and select a choice, and we will get back. Okay, the poll is now closed. And Tom, I am going to let you know here how our audience answered. 43% of them answered it's cheaper not to. And 29% said I don't know how. And 14% for two of them, it's inconvenient and I use non-hazardous lamps. So that is our summary. And Tom, I'll turn it back to you now.
Okay. Thank you, Irene. Well, isn't that's very interesting information. Very good to know that about our audience. Certainly, you know, the fact that it potentially is cheaper not to, that's certainly a very valid point, and we will address that as we move forward with our presentation. Not knowing how to recycle, we are going to address that head on in just a few seconds. And certainly the issues of convenience and whether or not the lamps are not hazardous, we're going to. So thank you very much for that. Good. All right, and so how appropriate that in our next section, we will be looking more closely at the various options for how to recycle lamps. Ah, there it is. All right. Options for every facility. All right, here we are. How to recycle lamps and what are the options? This slide is great in that it pretty much summarizes the 3 very good options that are available to facilities across the country. These options are suited to customer needs dependent on the number of lamps produced and the state in which the lamps are generated. First is mail-back recycling. Shipping of intact lamps in prepaid shipping boxes that are simply packed and then given to your local postage handler, typically FedEx or UPS. Various companies produce these prepaid shipping containers, which historically have a puncture-resistant plastic sleeve to help contain any lamps that are broken during shipping. Prepaid shipping boxes are certainly convenient, as you can have them on hand and simply fill the boxes and ship them as needed, thus decreasing storage needs and potential breakage during storage. And as you see, we've indicated that this is a great option for small quantities. For larger facilities, there are some other bulk options that can be more cost-effective, and we will cover these options in a minute. These boxes range in size to handle all types and quantities of lamps. Incidentally, over the years, our sponsor, AirCycle Corporation, has made various improvements to their shipping containers, but recently launched their newest container that they call Vapor Shield. Vapor Shield features an innovative design to the box, such that it completely contains mercury vapor and glass powder from any potential breakage in transit. The box is fully sealed and does not require a plastic sleeve of any kind, thus allowing for faster and safer packing of the box, which significantly decreases lamp breakage that often occurs during packing. So this graphic shows the flow of lamps that are being mailed. Lamps are shipped for recycling using a prepaid mailing label. Then the lamps are recycled at a fully permitted facility. Facilities automatically receive additional boxes for more lamps, and they get recycling certificates that document the weight of mercury in all lamps recycled. Next is the option of bulk pickup for lamp recycling. Bulk pickups are where a facility can schedule a pickup directly from its facility for multiple types of waste in large quantities. This makes sense for larger operations as thousands of lamps can be shipped at a time, as well as other waste like batteries and electronics. And here is the third option, drum top crushing units that can compact up to 1,200 lamps into a single drum. Drum top crushing units are designed to minimize storage space requirements and provide for safe storage. Crushing of lamps is allowed in 39 states and is typically the most economical recycling option for facilities that generate more than 3,000 lamps per year. This unit is the bulb eater made by our sponsor, AirCycle Corporation. It has many advanced safety features, including automatic cutoffs and a 3-stage filter that registers mercury emission levels that are well below OSHA standards and oftentimes considered non-detectable. AirCycle Corporation also provides comprehensive online training and certification for users. Additionally, I found that companies that are crushing their lamps and use this device, it helps them to create a very systematic process and protocol for recycling lamps that ensures that lamps are handled and recycled properly. With this said, I do believe that this is a good time for us to hear a little bit more about today's sponsor. So again, I'll turn it over to Irene for a few words about AirCycle Corporation.
Thank you, Tom. AirCycle Corporation is proud to sponsor this American School and Hospital Facility webinar on lamp recycling with Tom Griffin. If your facility is currently running the risk of fines, negative PR, and environmental hazards by not recycling lamps, or your current lamp recycling program is less efficient than it could be, AirCycle can help you implement a cost-effective lamp recycling program to help your facility stay compliant with environmental regulations. AirCycle's Bulb Eater Lamp Crusher and the bulk pickup service provide convenient and efficient lamp recycling for large facilities, while the Easy Pack Mailback Lamp Recycling Program, featuring the new industry-leading Vapor Shield box design, is perfect for small facilities. With AirCycle, you can go green, save money, and do your part to protect our environment. Call 800-909-9709 or visit aircycle.com to start your lamp recycling program today. Tom, back to you.
Thank you, Irene. Okay, so now we know what options there are for packaging and shipping lamps for recycling. Now let's learn a little bit about how lamps are actually recycled. So lamps are sent either intact in prepaid shipping containers, or they are picked up in bulk at your facility. Or if you're using a drum top crusher such as the Bulb Eater, the crushed lamps are shipped in sealed drums. Once shipped, the lamps arrive at a licensed and permitted lamp recycling facility. Here the lamps, either crushed or intact, will be loaded into equipment similar to this that fully separates the components of the lamps. Here is a nice diagram that shows the lamp recycling process that occurs at the recycling facility. First, if not already crushed, the facility crushes the lamps and then separates them into component parts: glass, metal, and mercury-bearing phosphor powder. Once crushed, the powder goes through a separate process called retort that vaporizes the mercury by heating it. And then it collects and cools it back into a pure metal, leaving pure phosphor as well. Additionally, the metal and crushed glass go through this same process in order to remove all mercury and phosphorus contaminants. The result is fully separated materials, all ready to go back into new products. Here is what a mercury retort machine looks like. All materials are processed through the machine. The result is fully separated materials. All right, so we've looked at why to recycle and how to recycle. Let's get back to what happens if you don't recycle. In essence, the consequences for not recycling lamps are basically just the opposite of the benefits of when you do recycle lamps. We've certainly looked at the negative impacts of mercury on the environment, your staff, and the general public. And we've touched on the poor message to staff and customers, and for that matter, to regulators when you're not recycling lamps. So now we're going to look more closely at exactly what the regulators are concerned about and what can happen if you are not recycling your spent lamps. Lamps contain mercury. Mercury is a priority toxin. Therefore, lamps, in general, when being disposed of, are assumed to be classified as hazardous waste. And who cares about that? Well, that little agency in the middle does, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and all of the state-based environmental agencies as well. They take hazardous waste very seriously. And as a hazardous waste, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, requires that all handling, storage, transport, treatment, and final disposal be in accordance with established hazardous waste regulations. RCRA requires that all hazardous waste be fully tracked from cradle to grave to ensure that they are handled responsibly and appropriately. The full extent of RCRA requirements generally assumes that these materials are being disposed of in a hazardous waste permitted landfill or incinerated by a hazardous waste incinerator. However, in its wisdom, RCRA also includes provisions that encourage recycling of certain potentially hazardous materials as universal waste. The general provisions of RCRA still apply to universal waste, but there are many fewer regulations and requirements than there are for disposal. Here are the materials that have specifically been recognized and can be treated as universal waste, and this list certainly includes lamps. Universal wastes require relatively little record keeping, but labeling and some level of record keeping is important because you are still responsible for ensuring that these potentially hazardous materials do not contaminate the environment. If not recycled, they are hazardous, and you are subject to all the rules that apply. Here again are our options for lamp recycling. All intact lamps can be recycled as universal waste, and crushed lamps are also considered to be universal waste in 9 states. And again, for universal waste, there are significantly reduced regulatory requirements. This is a summary of what is and isn't required for universal waste. First, EPA ID numbers are typically not needed, and neither are shipping manifests, unless being shipped to other states for recycling where different regulations apply. Next, labeling. Some sort of labeling is always required. The wording shown here works very well, as it lets everyone know, especially a regulatory inspector, exactly how you're intending to manage these lamps. In states that allow crushed lamps to be managed as universal waste, there is often a very clear stipulation that the operator follow all manufacturer specifications and that all lamp components be properly recycled. And the regulations and regulatory interpretation can vary for each state, so there may be a few additional requirements that apply. Not sure why we jumped forward there. Let's see. Sorry. And these are the 9 states where crushed lamps can be recycled as universal: Colorado, Florida, Illinois, Maryland, Montana, New Mexico, Tennessee, Texas, and the great Commonwealth of Virginia. Got out of order there, sorry. Okay. Next, facilities in 30 additional states also have the option of crushing lamps. However, in these states, they do have to manage the lamps as hazardous waste. All hazardous waste management requirements do apply in these states. However, the cost savings and benefits of crushing lamps often outweigh any additional regulatory requirements. Aha. Excuse me, it's 32 states there that now allow crushing of lamps as hazardous waste. And this is a quick summary of requirements in those states. The weights must be counted against the facility's generator status. Only recycling facilities that are permitted to handle hazardous waste can receive the materials. Shipping manifests and EPA IDs are required. And for small or large quantity generators, some additional record keeping and other requirements may apply. Now there are some legal options to the recycling of lamps. You can legally dispose of lamps as hazardous waste in a subtitle C landfill or in a permitted hazardous waste incinerator. However, the cost of these 2 options is much higher than recycling, and the raw materials will certainly not be reclaimed. There is another option that some facilities attempt to use, and that is to manage the lamps as non-hazardous. Many of you have seen or may be using some of the new low mercury or green tip lamps, as indicated in our poll earlier. They have been designed to minimize mercury use to the extent that they do not test as a hazardous material. Low mercury lamps typically have 3 to 4.5 milligrams of mercury versus other brands which may have 6 to 10 milligrams of mercury. Low mercury lamps may provide some advantages to users if they can be declared non-hazardous. However, many users mistakenly assume that they can simply throw green tip lamps away in the regular trash. You see, the hazardous waste laboratory test for mercury requires that lamps test below 0.2 milligrams per liter, and these lamps typically will meet that standard. However, Subtitle D, or solid waste landfills, are generally restricted from accepting any mercury-containing items at a concentration of greater than 0.025 milligrams per liter. And many other landfills these days have banned the acceptance of any mercury-containing devices altogether. Another point that I like to make is simply from the practical standpoint of what is right. So you're recycling lamps that contain 5 milligrams of mercury because that will test as hazardous. But if you have a green tip lamp that contains only 4 milligrams of mercury, you're going to throw it into the trash. All mercury is harmful. Bottom line, all lamps, hazardous, non-hazardous, or universal waste, they all still should be recycled. But of course, there is one last option, the improper disposal of lamps. All right, do you remember our ugly dumpster full of lamps? Let's pretend that I'm an inspector and I've just walked up on this scene. Am I going to be happy? Well, certainly this is a blatant RCRA violation on several different levels. Improper management and storage, and improper waste determination and disposal. This would result in citations and fines for this facility. Of course, this isn't the typical thing you see. More often, facilities are tossing away a couple of lamps at a time. As an inspector, you're inspecting all waste-related activities in the facility. Paints and printing supplies, cleaning supplies, laboratory chemicals, solvents, batteries, oils, and then you ask them to show how they are managing their lamps. And at that point, the room sometimes gets very quiet. There are various misconceptions out there regarding the regulation of lamps. Many facilities mistakenly believe that they can get away with throwing 4 or 5 lamps away in the dumpster because they are conditionally exempt small quantity generators, and that RCRA rules do not apply. Additionally, they rationalize that they will never get inspected, or they might be relying upon the old adage of dilution is the solution, or that throwing away green tip lamps is allowed. It is true that some commercial buildings, which are conditionally exempt, have less RCRA requirements, and for the most part do not get routinely inspected. However, all commercial facilities are completely responsible for any and all violations that do harm to the environment. And any facility can be inspected at any time. All it takes is for one disgruntled staff person to call in a complaint. And EPA inspectors will be there very quickly to enforce RCRA regulations to their fullest extent. And believe me, dilution as a solution does not appear anywhere within RCRA. And of course, we fully addressed the low mercury lamps issue previously, in that they may pass TCLP testing for being non-hazardous, but they will not pass the mercury landfill ban restrictions. And of course, Improper disposal leads to direct exposures to your workers and the public. Here's that dumpster one more time. You're asking your workers to toss these into the dumpster where they break, releasing mercury emissions. And so the residues from those lamps sit in the bottom of that dumpster. And when it rains, the storm water runs into the local storm sewer and potentially directly into the local water body. And if you were ever to get caught, this would simply not be good for your company's public image. Here you see some real headlines with very significant fines and penalties attached to them. And so on this very frightening note, I hope that we have convinced you today that recycling your lamps is simply the right thing to do for many reasons. Folks, lamps contain mercury. Mercury is a toxin that is causing significant impacts on the environment, and it is harmful to mankind, especially developing fetuses and children. And it's also getting in the way of my love for fishing and eating fish. Luckily, though, recycling lamps is an easy thing to do, and it will keep your company out, at least for bad reasons such as these. This concludes our presentation, but I do believe we are planning to spend some time answering questions from our audience. Irene, do we have any questions today?
We do. Thank you, Tom, for that great presentation. Now, if you haven't already done so, I'd like to now invite you, our attendees, to submit questions. You can submit your question by typing them in on the GoToWebinar Control Panel Question tab, and then click Send. And Tom, I do have a question here, and so we'll just get started. And for our other attendees, you just start typing away, and we'll answer them as they come in. Our first question: what are the main components to put in place in order to have a comprehensive lamps recycling program?
Great, thank you, Irene.
Uh-huh.
Certainly when you're developing a program, folks like AirCycle Corporation and the other recycling companies are going to be a great resource for learning more, certainly about the options that make sense for you. So certainly, you're going to want to assess how many lamps you are producing. You're going to want to look at your state regulations and what your options might be. And again, hopefully AirCycle or another company can help you with that information. But then also you're going to want to establish that process. Once you've determined what makes sense for you, when you've looked at the various options for recycling. Training is always a big part of it as well. You want to make sure that, especially if you're using a drum top crushing unit, that your operators are well trained and understand what they're doing and are taking any safety precautions that they may need to. But training is also very important relative to any of the recycling options to ensure that lamps aren't broken while they're being stored or while they're being packaged. And then documentation, whether universal waste regulations don't require nearly as many, nearly as much record keeping, etc. But at some level, you should be keeping track generally of how many you're generating because you are ultimately responsible. Last little piece to that, I would say, is labeling. Come up with some sort of labeling that declares how you're managing and recycling your lamps. And then lastly, in the long run, you'll want to do some checkups, perhaps some auditing to make sure that your staff is trained and is operating as you've agreed to.
Okay, Tom, I've got another one here. There was an EPA paper, a white paper, on lamp crushing that expressed grave concerns about lamp crushing. Has something changed?
I'm certainly very familiar with that study. I mentioned earlier in the presentation. I actually was involved in the coordination of that study because 2 of the testing sites were in Virginia at the time. And yes, there are various questions even about the whole process of crushing. As I mentioned before, there are only, I guess, I think it's actually ends up being 40 states that allow crushing. 11 do not allow crushing at all for various reasons. So there are some concerns by various folks about crushing. However, my opinion is that overall crushing is a much safer alternative than the practice of putting intact lamps into boxes, especially the storage and handling component of that, because many times the spent lamps are, just being stored haphazardly, if you will, especially when you do not have a good program or process in place. So yes, you do need to look at the options available. Again, the crushing option is probably best only for larger or for facilities that generate a good many number of lamps. But it definitely does have some very strong benefits. And on the side of mercury emissions, I completely feel that on the mercury emissions side, you are exposed, your workers are exposed to much less emissions in the aggregate by using a crushing device rather than just shipping intact.
Okay, I've got another one here. Are there any business or tax advantages to recycling lamps?
Very good question. I'm not actually, I know that in certain states, I know that in Virginia, there are various tax credits that you could receive for recycling equipment. I am not specifically sure if it has been applied to lamp recycling products and services. Sorry, I don't have that answer.
Okay.
But a very good point, and probably something the AirCycle folks would like to look into.
Sounds good. I say, Tom, I've got another one. Sort of, it's a little bit different. I was informed that alkaline batteries need not be recycled and are just regular trash. You being an expert, what is the official answer?
The official answer is that there is nothing in alkaline batteries that makes them hazardous at this point. However, I couldn't tell you the full metallic makeup of them, but 99% of them are metals, and they're readily recyclable. Sometimes, I'll admit, it is a little bit hard to find places that will recycle consumer batteries even. However, I do know that AirCycle Corporation offers to recycle alkaline batteries as well, in addition to the whole array of batteries, many of which are still considered hazardous. So in general, it's not required, but it is still a very good thing to do.
Okay. This question. We focused primarily on commercial tube lighting. What about residential CFL recycling? How does residential disposal contribute overall to increased mercury in the environment? And how should someone stress the importance of recycling one CFL when their nearest recycling center is difficult and far to reach? Are there alternatives?
Well, the CFL phenomena, if you will, has been pretty incredible to watch and see how it has grown. You all saw the graphic that we had up earlier. That actually was, I thought that was a graphic that really showed the impact of fluorescence in general on the reduction of energy usage, so and consequently on reducing mercury overall in the environment. So CFLs, like I said, contain about 4 milligrams of mercury, and that in and of itself, I believe they actually do test out as hazardous overall because we're dealing with a smaller amount. However, on the municipal side, there basically is an exemption, a household hazardous waste exemption that applies in most all states. There are certain states that are not allowing, I mentioned before that they have landfill bans, so that no mercury-containing equipment and materials can be allowed into those landfills. So, you know, more and more the arrow is pointing in the direction of recycling. The great thing too is that I've been impressed by the dramatic increase. The big box stores, the Home Depots and the Lowe's of the world, all typically are accepting them in one way or another, and you're finding that many of your landfills and local waste management boards are providing for the collection and recycling of CFLs as well. So definitely a big issue, and hopefully you know, the general public is getting that message as well.
Okay, Tom, you mentioned that 40 states allowed crushing. Someone here is asking, is crushing allowed in California?
Crushing is not allowed in California. However, I do believe that even the AirCycle folks, and I know we've talked with some folks, as the credibility of the latest machines seems to be increasing, and certainly the emission levels are just seem to be kind of off the charts, non-detectable. And so I believe that some discussions are happening, and in all of those states. I know that that AirCycle Corporation and some of the other companies out there are working to encourage lamp crushing, you know, and address any concerns that those states and EPA might still have.
Okay, Tom, we've got time for one more question, and I have one here that we'll finish with. We do recycle fluorescent lamps. Should we also recycle sodium vapor bulbs too?
I believe the answer there is yes. If I'm correct in that assumption, sodium vapor bulbs also contain mercury, I believe, unless I'm categorically off there. But I know that AirCycle Corporation does also handle those sodium vapor lamps as well. I can, if you wanted to email me directly, I could get you the definitive answer on that if you'd like. Okay. And I'll leave my email as well. I'm simply tom@greenerresults.com.
Okay, tom@greenerresults.com. And also, I'm sorry we could not get to all of the remaining questions, but another opportunity would be please email your questions to info@aircycle.com, and you'll receive an answer shortly. And thanks, Tom. We'll have to leave it there. And I'd like to extend a huge thank you to you, Tom, for doing such a tremendous job with today's presentation. And thanks to our sponsor, AirCycle, home of the award-winning bulb eater lamp crusher and Easy Pack recycling containers. Lastly, a sincere thank you to all the attendees for giving us their time and attention today. And as a reminder, this webinar will be archived on the American School and Hospital Facility webinar page at facilitymanagement.com within the week. Thank you, and have a nice afternoon.